All right. Welcome everyone to the NDD Huddle this week. Our topic today is NDD back to basics. So the manual process of doing it, as well as like the details and how to actually step through it. We're gonna, I think, start with a little intro because we got some new faces, including me, which is why this is very funny that I'm doing this part. Hello, I'm Alex Rowell. I'm the new community manager at Zelvio, and you'll see me around all over the place now. I'm based in Portland area, so Pacific time zone, and we're not going to do like the fun fact and all that. Sam, do you want to do an intro, even though they know you already?
Sure. Founder of Zolvio, stepped down as CEO, now leading the narrative team. And as part of the consulting practice that we did for the last 10 years, I want to say, used a ton of different techniques, agile techniques, event storming, domain-driven design, behavior-driven development, and all of these things got merged into this practice that we are all gathered here today to talk about, which is NDD.
Awesome. And maybe I'll pick on Michael. Hmm?
Hey everyone, Michael Fox. I have been working now with the narrative team for a couple of months, and I'm helping on the product side and doing a bunch of discovery with everyone here. And I would say I live in Nevada and just really excited for these engagements. And if there are product folks or you have opinions on product, one of the things I'm also working on is how to think about NDD from the product side of the universe versus the architect and development side of the universe as well.
Awesome. And Camille's getting mercy this week, so she'll get a intro next week due to a tragic pickleball injury.
It's not pretty. Nobody needs to see.
All right, awesome. Sam, do you want to go ahead and kick us off?
Sure thing. So back to basics. Nothing like going back to basics, like having a completely white blank sheet on Miro. So this is as basic as it gets. I'm going to take us to Miro today rather than into the application. So what do we mean by back to basics? Well, what do we try and get out of NDD? Like what's the outcome? What's the output? Ultimately, it's increase the bandwidth communication between teams. And by doing that, you get a marked difference in your delivery speed. So the reason is because you can start to think of software delivery as like just two square halves to begin with. Like if I just do this one right here, and that's like the requirements gathering, right? And ultimately this leads to specs. We'll talk about specs in just a second. Excuse me. And then we have the specs to code. All right, so on the right-hand side is requirements to specs and then specs to code. Those are like the two square halves, if you like, of software delivery. And this part tends to be the harder one. This is the one that's the messy front end. Like once you have a decent amount of specs and you understand what needs to be done, taking that to its completion through code is a process that is mostly well known. Like once you have an understanding of what's needed, you get a bunch of smart developers, they can go ahead and code that away. And it's not to say that it's a factory and that they're just, taking in specs and coding. It's more that it's the specifications are an understanding. And so this is where I'd like to just tear apart the concept of specifications. Specifications are a means to communicate from one party to another. They are a way to say, here's something that has been designed and here's how we expect it to be created. And so they are a communication. Specifications are communication. And because they're communicating design, therefore they are communication of design. That's my definition of specifications. And so the first part then is, how do you go from high-level requirements and ramblings into low-level specifications? And so then we get into a few different pieces here. We go into the first part, which is some level of discovery that you have to do, right? You have to figure out like what it is that you want to create in the first place. And this is very much within the domain of product. And so you have this discovery. I'm going to call it a phase, even though they're not really very linear, but like, let's go from discovery to the next phase. What we'll find there is that the next thing that happens is design. And that means like, hey, we've got this problem space or opportunity or challenge or something, and you go through a process of discovery to figure out what that is, the want. Like the discovery is all about identifying what you want, right? And then going into the design is when you're saying, how do we create a solution for that? So this is really the space where you go into solution. Once you understand the solution space, then you move into delivery. And I'm really trying to find the last box here is called learn. I'm trying to find a word that begins with D for learn, but I can't find one yet. But you can, once you've delivered something, then you learn about it, and then you go back and it sort of creates this feedback cycle. Like, all right, so that's in terms of the software delivery space. Like, this isn't anything new. This is something that people have spoken about in many different ways, in a lot of past studies. Like, there's the rational unified process. It talked about inception, elaboration, and I can't remember the 4 different phases. But I'm not the first to come up with sort of 4 different phases to describe something. But I just want to put some structure around the process of gathering requirements. And so this requirements gathering leading to specs. Well, specs are needed down here. Like, if you want to go specs to code, you need the specs to code down here. So if I just bring a little sticky and put that over here and say, by this time, you should have specs. Now, what does specs even mean? Like, okay, so they're communication of design, but in the realm of like a real team, are these on a Jira ticket? Are these on a wiki document? Are these conversations? Are these emails? Are these Slack messages? And the answer is it's all of the above, right? They're all communications, and they're just not very formal. And that's kind of one of the problems, is that it's not very formal. There's not really much of formality in this space. Once you get into delivery and you have a ticket and you have acceptance criteria are a form of specs. If you have given when then scenarios, they're a form of specs. And so really, there's not a standardized way to do it. There's really good studies about how to do delivery, like with the to-do, doing, done, or in QA, in prod, and all the different columns you have for delivery. But the process of specs there's not really much in terms of standardization. There's just however this particular team does it, which isn't a bad thing, all right? But I just wanted to sort of start by like scoping this out, saying that requirements live up here. Right? The requirements are something that comes out of discovery. You first have to understand what it is you want before you can have any requirements. And then you go through a process of design, and then you end up, once you have a solution, whether it's formal or not, is you end up with specs. I'll pause there for a sec just to kind of make sure that like we're all tracking and see if there's any opinions or any questions or any disagreements that we can talk through.
Makes sense.
Cool. All right. So the next question is then, like, what role is NDD playing in here? Like, so great, we have requirements to specs, and then we have specs to code. What is the role of NDD? I like to think that NDD is something that's going to sit right in the middle of this whole process. So if I just grab one of these purple stickies right there and just put that in here, and it's the grease between it all. It's a mechanism that allows each one of these different parts of the process to be able to interact with one another. Because in reality, these aren't linear. Like, this goes this way, then that goes that way, and then this goes up here, and then like just the way teams work, it's all over the place. Like, it's not necessarily what's supposed to be cut and dry. Like, it's not just well known. Like, it's not linear. That's the easiest way to say it. There are arrows going in all sorts of different directions. But this is the main flow. So we can assume a main flow that we would like to achieve, like to keep driving towards, but there's all this feedback in the middle. And this is where NDD really is supposed to help out. Like, this is where it's designed to help out. It's by enabling communication to happen at high bandwidth. So each one of these lines is communication. So let's put something like that into context. You're designing something, and then you realize, oh, wait a minute, this is actually not feasible. Okay, well, let's go back to discovery. You're in delivery, you realize that there's a piece of information missing, and you think, well, the design didn't account for that. So you go back to design. Now, that doesn't mean you have to block the bus, like stop the bus and go back to design. It just means while you're coding, you might have to slightly change the design. But the point is, you are going back and forth between these phases. So it helps to understand these purely from a modeling point of view, that these are the different stages or phases that exist, and you could be switching back and forth between them quite a lot. And there's nothing that helps you structure that. And NDD is a way to structure that. So how does it do it? What's the secret? Like, how do you have something that can work across the entire cycle like this, that allows you to follow this whole process? And the secret is time. The secret is sequencing things through time. That is that's where the name narrative comes from. Like it's a sequence of moments over time. And we do this in everyday life. Like we communicate with each other by telling stories. And the reason stories work so well, if you think about it, is because they are based on time and we're able to understand things step by step. And that gives us the deeper understanding of what we need. So what if you could take that way in which humans work, the way we understand the world, the way that we quantize time and try and slot things as to what happened first, what happened next for us to understand things? What if we could put that into a practice? Think about any story you ever want you want to understand, any process you want to understand. If you want to know how your insurance is going to work, you're like, okay, so first I get the paperwork, and then after I sign the paperwork, I do this, and then when I get a claim, I have to do the claim, and I go through this. But everything is a sequence of time, steps across time. So, this is what NDD does. It brings that human trait of understanding the world in terms of time, and we bring it into the software delivery process. Please feel free to interrupt me at any point. I'll keep checking in because I can ramble forever. Speaking of ramblings, I will ramble. So I just want to make sure that I've got, people here able to ask questions. So I'll pause for a sec. All right. So let's see what that means. If I just grab this Miro table right here, and it's just a nice table. So you can do this with Miro. You can do this on a whiteboard. You can create a grid on a whiteboard and get some sticky notes. There's no need to do this in anything that's high-fi. I mean, to start with, to understand it, you don't need anything more than just 3 columns like this, three rows. So let's give these rows some names. We're going to call this one here the context, and we'll put that right down in the middle. I'll just blow that up a little bit. And we'll call this one the interaction. And the one at the bottom we'll call system, because this is all about building systems that people can interact with along with some business context. All right. And what you do is, and I know we went over this last week, I'm just going to give a quick overview of it again, is that you start with the outcome. So this is the anatomy of a narrative. And you have a sequence of frames. Each one of these is a moment, is a frame of time. So think about it like a script in a movie. This is, frame by frame by frame, almost like a video editor. And you want to start with just creating the business context. And it doesn't matter where you do this. Like I say, it could be whiteboards, it could be Miro, it could be the narrative app. You grab one of these stickies, and this is a moment in time. And what you want to do is you want to put these moments in sequence to describe what's happening. So this might be, the dog enters the house, the dog smells the food, they eat the food, and then they leave the house, right? Like that's just a sequence of moments that allow me to understand what you're talking about. Therefore, it is my context. And what you want to do is just make sure that everybody that is with you understands the sequence. So if it's like let me just actually exemplify this. Can somebody give me an idea for a quick system to create?
How about a to-do application?
All right, the classic to-do, let's do it. So what we're going to say here is I want to plan, my outcome will be plan my tasks for the day, right? And the first thing I might do is, I think about the things I want to get done. We'll just say that's a persona. That's Matt thinks about the things he wants to get done. He adds a bunch of tasks, prioritizes them, and then starts on the first task. Something like that. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight here that the first thing you want to do is just sequence these in a way that makes sense. And so if there's something else that's missing here, well, okay, maybe I need to add some, as I do them, I need to add like a due date to them, like adds due dates. And you want to have this as a conversation with a bunch of people. So what else can we have in this to-do list flow? What's missing here? If anything.
Would closing or finishing a task be part of this flow or a different flow?
Sure. So then what we can do is we can say that would be a new narrative. So you'd want to do it. Let me see if I can copy all this like that. That would be a new narrative. So I'd just create a new one here, and it would be like, completing tasks. And it's an open question, like marks tasks as complete. Let's just put it there um, as an outcome. And you know, you'd go ahead and fill that outcome, assuming that's a separate narrative, or like you said, you might put it in the same narrative. And so the question is then that we get this question a lot, like, should you be branching the narratives, or should you just be creating a single one? And the answer is, look at the outcome, sharpen the outcome, plan my tasks for the day. Does that include me closing them? I would even argue that starting the task isn't part of that. Like, that's it. The outcome right there is just get to prioritize them. That's the final moment. That's the happy path. You stop there. And then you can create branches from here or parallel paths for that. So we get this far. And the next thing we do is we start to overlay interfaces, and we see like what kind of things do we want in that. So over here, he adds a bunch of tasks. Well, that's probably the task add widget or component. Then here is the adds due date, probably the same one. I was supposed to say dialogue on here. And then prioritizes them. So then you're going to get a drag and drop, maybe drag and drop of cards drag and drop. So you overlay the interactions. And again, this is something you can do anyway. You can see me doing this on Miro today. I don't have to do this with the app. And I can, if I want to add something before this here, like an action, which is actually the next thing you want to do, the task. Sorry, my bad. I went the wrong way on that one. I want to go at the end. So what we say is like when I add in the task dialog, when I add something, that would go to an action over here, which is to add the task. Just make that the right color. And I can draw an arrow from here to here. And this is telling me that there's an action. When I from the task add dialog, I can add the task. This is a system interaction, and this is the user interaction. So from the interface, I can click a button and it will take the action on the system side. And this is how we start to create the relationships between them. Any questions from anyone?
I've
Is there
got
any
one that's
particular
going to horrible. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
This one's probably a derail. So like, I would be the one that would be the moment to moment. I live in the context. How do I make sure that I have the right people in the room to, like, what is the system? What are all the other pieces? And make sure that the people are already in the room when we're having these initial discussions, right?
That's a great question. So it's, you know, what you want to be bringing in here is if somebody knows about all these areas, great. Like, that's not always the case, though, especially in larger and larger teams. And so you want to bring in the right people who are going to be working on the system side of things. And so this is where your technical people would attend this session. You want to have, from the interaction point of view, you want to ideally get the user experience folks. And from the context, you want to get the business people. Traditionally, this is called a sort of the three amigos in behavior-driven development. Three amigos was the developers, the product owners, and the QAs. In this world, in NDD, the equivalent of three amigos for the systems lane, it would be tech and QA. So anyone from that realm. Within context, it'd be your business folks, stakeholders, and so on. And then for the interaction, it would be the design folks. These people were left out, unfortunately, from a lot of the previous practices. So, you know, this is us bringing them in. Alex, would you mind just running with this session for just 2 minutes while I let the contractor in at the door, and I'll be right back.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I can run this session for sure. Matthew, what was your actual question? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut over you.
So I was curious about why the add the task action was part of a new column versus being in the same column as the context and the UI.
I
I'll
think that
take an
might be a
answer.
Michael
I'll
question.
give an
Thank you.
answer here. So when you're doing narrative-driven development, when you add the task, this is actually where the backend system will be performing a set of actions. So you would attach specifications and potentially other things that you might want to do within the system itself related to adding a task. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so.
Or was it more about why is it not in the same lane as where the context or the interaction sits? Maybe that was, I don't know if I took that the wrong way either, Matthew, but that's the way I heard it. Why is add the task sitting one step forward?
Yeah, exactly.
I think if you think about it from the terms of like time, so if we have a user over here that is you, Matt, you're clicking on the task add dialog, and we're assuming here that you actually created the task. If not, then we can shift that over. But this is assuming that you're actually saying add the task, and then this sends a request to the backend. So let me demystify something real quick. So if we have here, this is an interface. It could be a component or a page or whatever. And this is a system. When the relationship is this way, this is a command or a submit. When the relationship is this way, I can just shift that the other way, put it over here, and put that to this side. Well, that's a query or a fetch, right? So this is the system giving data to an interface to display. This is an interface creating, commanding or submitting something to the system. Then we have one of these, which is an interface to interface. Let's reverse that. That would be a navigation. That is that I clicked on one page and went to another page and there was no system interaction at all. And then finally, we have this one here, which is a reaction. And that is to say, hey, this system did something and it needs to trigger another system to do something. These are the 1, 2, 3, 4 building blocks of, you can represent any complex system out there with these 4 building blocks, four transitions, I should say. So then when you put these in sequence and in something like this, you can really start to say, what does the overall interaction slice by slice, frame by frame look like?
Gotcha.
So yeah, I wanna just check in with everybody, see if this back to basics approach is something that is making sense as to like that you would do with a whiteboard or Miro or the narrative app. What other questions would you have on the basics of creating narratives after seeing this?
One thing that stands out to me is that there's sort of 2 different subjects to different kinds of narratives. We started out not with the customer experience so much, but we started out with the product development experience. And there is a time sequence narrative to discovery and design and delivery and learning. But that's a separate kind of narrative than this experience of the user. How do you treat those 2 different subjects and 2 different kinds of narratives?
Gotcha. I think let me just make sure I understand that. So we've got this narrative here, which is sort of ultimately creating a set of specifications for us. So that's like the output. And this is a great trigger, by the way, for me to come back to this idea. The narrative on this side is ultimately helping us create the specs. And it's also helping us come up with a solution together. Like what we find is that when you go through this process, even if you haven't done any designing at all, just from getting as a starting point, it can start the process of taking a concept from discovery through a design, and then it can create more tasks for people to do. So it's a very iterative process that, you know, when you first start out, you might not have a full idea of the whole solution, and it finds holes in those in that for you. Or you might have an idea for a solution, and going through the technique will find holes in that, because you've got lots of people trying to dissect the reality frame by frame. Mm-hmm. So that's the interplay between the narrative, which is, you know, we're talking here specifically about planning my tasks for the day, and there's the positive side effects of how that helps you create some, you know, a pit, what we call the pit of success here for your process. Because, you know, you're saying, hey, I've got something that came out of discovery. Can we do it? Traditionally, you might go design an entire system, give it to delivery, and then you realize there's like a million holes in it. And so by taking something like this and inserting it into this process of going from requirements to specs, that red box right there, what you're doing is you're saying, if we use time to sequence that for this particular outcome and this other outcome, like if discovery tells us all the outcomes it would like to achieve by way of requirements, then the combination of all these narratives sequenced over time, interrelated with one another, will help us find all the holes in our stories. And that is really what it's doing, is it's filling this area of the process. Does that answer the question?
Yes, yes. I think I was looking at applying the word narrative to that 4-step cycle as a different concept than applying the narrative within it.
Gotcha.
And I wanted to check and see, am I over applying the word narrative to use these two different contexts and just going to confuse myself? And it seems that I'm better off keeping the focus on the narrative to the right side that helps us navigate the cycle of discovery, design, develop, and learn.
Exactly that. I mean, yeah, I would say like narrative-driven development as an approach will have touch points across these different areas, which are idiosyncratic to every business and how they do things. There's going to be some touch points in there. For example, what we're doing right now with this like solutioning, if you like, this could be add narratives to your design process. And that's something that you'd put in here. And maybe you want to do that before UX or after UX. It's up to you. But at some point, it acts as a check to make sure that you've got your story right. When it comes to discovery, you might want to be looking, do we have all our outcomes listed? Or if you're doing something like jobs to be done, which I know, Adam, you're a great fan of, is that you would define the jobs in terms of the outcomes that the people would be getting from them. And so then that would be the impact of NDD here, among others. I mean, I can talk about how NDD has a bunch of different things that you can integrate. When it comes to learning, you might be like, okay, well, look, we've developed this narrative, but how much ROI are we getting on this narrative? So like, okay, if I attribute a value to this narrative here and say this gives us $1 million per year in terms of revenue, and it has a cost of whatever, like you can start to put metrics and things around your narratives to aid in your learn cycle. And so narrative-driven development as a practice can integrate into all of these different areas and to facilitate conversations and feedback and a centralized source of truth. So on that aspect, that's the narrative aspect, but you wouldn't apply the sequence of narratives in there. I think maybe you could, but it gets a bit too meta. I think for the slicing of time, I would take that as a means of the modeling of your system requirements and your systems.
Mm-hmm. Do you make a practice of evaluating the fitness for purpose of each narrative?
You should be doing that. Like, I mean, ultimately, does it solve, I've got a problem that I'm trying to solve over here from discovery or a requirement, and, we've designed the system. Yeah. You can test it. You can test it now. Like now that we have this, it takes all of, half an hour to an hour to create a narrative together with a group of people. And that itself is a test. But then you can also roadshow that. You can take that to the next stakeholder or even customer and say, hey, look, I've got this thing I'm building. And it acts as a great way to quickly get people on the same page. Like the way I'd start is I'd say, so let me give you some context. We're building this to-do app, and we've got this outcome of wanting to plan the tasks for the day. To do that, here's a set of steps. Matt thinks about the things he wants to get done for the day. He has a bunch of tasks, adds a due date, and prioritizes them. It's like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. And you've just done level 1 understanding. You've level set. And then you say, all right, well, let's now talk about how that actually happens. So in the interface, you'll get this dialogue, that dialogue, and then that dialogue. Okay, I see how all that maps. Now let's talk about the systems. We open up the systems and start saying what happens when you add tasks. And then you can go deeper. So the next thing, and I haven't actually gone into that just yet, but what you do is even for every system right there, if I get rid of one of these rows, what we can do there is we can say, and this system itself has a sequence of steps that we want to take. All right, and here you can define the sequence of steps almost like a sequence diagram. Mm-hmm. So it's a different levels of understanding for different people. Up here, you might take a screenshot of, let me just grab something. I'll grab the UI itself here. I'll take the screenshot and then I'll say, and this over here is the screenshot for what this interface looks like. And so you can see what we're doing here is just adding depth of information to make sure that we have a centralized source of truth. And that's the second part of the problem of requirements to specs, is when you look at how people do it in the industry, it's left up to a few key people to piece all that information together. We call them glue people. All right, so there's a few glue people in your company that probably hold all this information together. They either keep meticulous Google Sheets up to date, or like Confluence pages, or they make sure all the tickets are related to one another. Like, there's some people that are just super aware of this problem instinctively, and the way they solve it is by having index pages. And really what they're trying to do is create a source of truth.
And this makes it explicit.
And this makes it explicit. This says, here's your virtualized source of truth. Like, here's whatever context you put in here, that's one source of truth. But maybe you've got a link to, if I just go to like another Miro board here and just grab the link of it. How do we do this? I think I can just demonstrate that here. I can copy link, for example, or a Jira ticket or something like that. So copy link right there. And if I just paste that in here, then there's my link, right? And I can put that into context too. And I can say over here, see this Miro board, right? And this gives you a standardized way of creating these indexes, which usually glue people do. And so it solves that cohesiveness of the information for you as you go through this very messy process of going from discovery to delivery and all that crazy distributed information that goes everywhere. This gives you a mechanism to bring it all together again.
Mm-hmm. Very helpful in switching people's context from here's the collection of systems that we manage to here's the different ways that people are interacting across these systems. And we may have a bunch of different narratives that each involve, a given system in our ecosystem. This is, we've been trying to do something like this by identifying capabilities. And then we have this little baseball card for each capability that lays out sort of the purpose, the customer facing fitness criteria, and the internal facing health metrics. But this seems very viable for drawing the picture at the I don't want to say interface level, but how are people actually using our tools and systems to get their needs met?
Exactly. It's very much, it's outcome driven. We have the ability to say, here's a sticky that represents a capability. Let's just use this color for that. And then, it maps to all of these narratives over here. So this is one part of that capability. So you can still follow these practices. I think the industry has done a great job. We don't want to just discard everything that's happened to date. I think there's been some amazing work that's happened. And this is just an add to that. And so this is nothing new, like the categorization of capabilities to feature sets to features to scenarios. That's from the BDD world. And so now we can just say, all right, let's slightly switch that to something more accessible. We'll keep the capability aspect, but a capability has a set of outcomes that it needs to achieve. And for each one of those outcomes, we're going to dissect it by time, using time to make sense of it. And then we're going to link all the information into a single flow so that when you look at it, you've got a single understanding. And, you don't have to go talk to 50 people and go talk to that person who knows this one thing about that thing that you need. This allows you to, bring it all together.
Thank you.
Welcome. Anybody else? So, go ahead. A microphone open.
Yeah, quick question, Sam. How do you go about distinguishing between a capability and an outcome? Is there a hard and fast rule? Would you sometimes just have a capability with a single narrative? In which case, it's not a hard and fast rule.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, to me, a capability is just a set of outcomes, right?
Okay. It depends on the overall scope.
Yeah. And if it's one capability with one outcome, then I mean, that's your narrative. You're doing it just for tidiness at that point. But yeah, it's when you start to have, you usually don't just have one outcome. Like when you look at the path of an outcome, it's one happy path. And seldom do you find any app that has anything that has only one outcome. Like there's always going to be the negative parts, like something happens, there was an error, there's always something. And so those would be, narratives and underneath that capability overall. So it doesn't hurt to have the capability be the same name as the narrative, especially knowing that you're going to have all the alternative flows and, negative flows be part of that as well.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Thanks.
Yep. So one other thing that pops up is like, why have an app, right? Like, why are we building an app if we can just do this with basics, and we can just do this on a whiteboard or even Miro, which is one of the best tools I've ever used in my entire life. Like, I am such a Miro fan. This is a little known fact, but they once called me in the early days and said, "Hey man, like, you're one of our top 1% users in terms of like use of Miro. What are you doing? Who are you?" They wanted to know about me. It's pretty cool, actually. So I chatted to them for a bit. So just to let you know, like, how much respect and admiration I have for Miro, and just the strength of the diagramming in it. And there's the secret, is diagramming. Like, the strength is it's in its diagramming. And when you have something like narratives, it's not a diagram, it's a model, right? We're building a model. And so what we want to do is have depth. So this can get unruly very quickly. Like, I'll just show you something here. If I want to add a specification to this thing here, so I'll go ahead and create let me go put in a code block because they're fun. There's a code block. I'll put it over here and I'll say, given, a task exists, given task A exists when Matt adds task A again, they are presented with error. Okay, great. I want to put this here. I want to associate it with this guy. But then I also want to associate the 50 other specs that we come up with over time. Hey, the front end thing needs a spec as well. Let's add some specs to this guy. Oh, this other one needs specs as well. Let's add some specs to that guy. This one has a screenshot, but I also need some specs, right? And so you can see, like, wow, I'm going to end up with a woolly mess pretty quickly. And so that's because it's a diagramming tool. It's designed to diagram. It's not designed to model and embed and do things. And so, when you go to something that is more purpose built, and I can create a narrative like that, or like when I reload, it will work. When I create a narrative, then where are these going? Oh, I'm sorry, this is the wrong. I need the new one. A second to load. But if I go over here and I create a narrative over here, first of all, I can minimize it. I don't have to have the narrative massive. Then I can open it
Sam,
up.
swap your screen share.
Oh, thank you. I see. I appreciate that. Let me just put that in. Okay. So here you can see, like, I've got this everything in one place, but I want to minimize all of this and tuck away all the information. I can do that over here. If that's my narrative, I can expand it, and then I can put some actions in it. Those actions themselves can have scripts. I can open those scripts. I can create some specifications, add them onto some spec, and I can put that here. And so this is the reason why we ended up building a tool and not just sticking to narrative, to Miro, is because these sorts of things just made it very unruly. And so NDD was born in Miro, actually. I'd love to, maybe another day I can show you a quick example, but we had these Miro boards just grow to such complexity that it was like, we really need a way to manage this. And that's when we started building a custom tool, and here we are. NDD was born. So the difference is diagramming versus modeling. When you're doing what I'm showing here, is you're actually modeling your system. You're not diagramming your system. And I think the same goes actually for things like architecture and things like even, the jobs to be done framework. I think if you built an app that is about modeling the thing rather than just diagramming it, you get a lot of benefits. There's a threshold, like diagramming will take you a certain amount of distance. And at some point when it becomes unruly, you want to switch over into something a bit more bespoke. All right, I think we've gotten to the end of the basics, and if anyone has more questions, I'm happy to dig into those. So Eric, I'll just ask you a question here. How have you tried, or have you seen the problem of like the distributed information be solved in the various places you worked? I know you come from an agile coaching background and still doing that probably. So yeah, how do people solve the distributed information problem in your experience?
Oh, it's easy for me to to think about how I have imagined it being solved than it is for me to point to how it really has been solved.
Okay.
And what was just floating around in my mind, I was connecting to some of Tom Gilb's work and wondering if that had been a factor or an inspiration. But it's probably more likely that it's just recently been on my mind, and so that I made the connection. But his planning language or language seems to address some of the same territory.
No,
or
thank
it's
you.
the same animal underneath. He has I don't know if he calls it the theory of 7 ones, where you find one stakeholder type, and from them you derive one type of value that they hold. Then you find one quality of your product that delivers that value, and then you come up with one design that delivers that quality. And you find one real instance of a person who's in that stakeholder type, and you plan how you're going to deliver that one design within 1 week, and you plan that within 1 hour. And he was an early iterative development pioneer, and it's maybe more focused on slicing than it is on the narrative. But each of those little slices of his ends up creating a narrative,
Right.
And enabling fast iterations.
That's awesome. Thanks for bringing that up. I remember language actually from, I don't know, last I looked at it briefly was I want to say 2015, something like that, or 2016. I remember I worked with someone, I was writing some testing frameworks for like that use Cucumber, and somebody came in and said, "Hey, have you heard this language?" I was like, "No, let me have a look." And I didn't look at it at the depth that you're talking about, and now I'm thinking I should. So if there's any inspiration, it's not intentional from it, but it sounds like what you're saying there is this like laser focus of, hey, there's a big mess of stuff that we need to do. Let's narrow it down with these, the ones framework that you just mentioned, so that you can get to a single flow ultimately. Yeah, there's probably some big inspiration to get from that actually. So thanks for that. Definitely wasn't intentional.
Oh, it's all tackling the same elephant, right?
So did you try it?
I have tried to use some things inspired by that, like making sure that the team actually understands who their stakeholders are, what are their stakeholders' needs, what do those stakeholders care about, and so here's these values, and then what is it that we offer that actually connects to those values. And so using that as a rough context for story slicing and being able to connect the dots all the way back to the human need, the outcome that we're targeting, has been useful with some teams.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? Like, I mean, it's even within agile practices. I remember there was a lot of, set your weekly target, right? Like set your the iteration, the goal of the iteration.
The sprint
right?
goal.
Yeah, the sprint goal, exactly. And it's like, it's prevalent, it's being used, it gets used everywhere. I think it gets a bit contrived, like user stories, in that, it's like, hey, we need to get this stuff done, so we'll just make that the outcome rather than what is the actual outcome we need to achieve, and then let's do the work for it. So I think, yeah, it's always been around, this concept of focusing on the outcomes, even in behavior-driven development. The advice from like the coaches give is that work backwards, like instead of doing given when then, say start with the then statement, and then define that helps you define the outcome that you want to achieve, and then you work backwards to achieve that outcome. So yeah, the concept of outcomes is very, very powerful, I think. And even in the military, it's like, let's not just focus on the outcome that's in 2 years from now. Let's focus on the next waypoint, the next waypoint, the next waypoint, so that it just keeps everybody focused. So yeah, there's definitely a very powerful concept.
Think big and work small.
Yeah, that's it. Does anyone else have any experience of like how glue people, like what kind of artifacts, and like who's a glue person that you work with?
Probably a product manager.
Yeah. What kind of artifacts have you seen them keep? How do they maintain this? The problem of distributed information and maintaining communication to the folks that need that communication. Like how have you seen that being solved?
Yeah. Well, we solve it actually. We started creating specific Slack channels per project, where it's basically like a mini wiki FAQ. Somebody asks a question and the PM will respond for everyone to see. But really, they're surfacing information that is buried somewhere in a ticket or in a specs being in the ticket for the most part. So yeah, I think it's just somebody has a question and they don't know where to look. And I think if you go into like a Linear or a Jira, it's really just a list of stories or tickets or whatever units of work are. I think how narratives helped is it's a bit more visual. So if they know the question they're asking is somewhere in the middle of the system, they'll just quite literally navigate there and open the spec, and they'll be at least somewhat closer to the answer. And then, you know, they could follow along the moments, go back in time or forward in time, and hopefully arrive at the point where they're at, and then maybe realize themselves that the information is there in the spec or the spec's missing, you know, but rather than asking the glue person to figure that out for them.
Yeah, because glue people don't scale, right? It's kind of the problem. Cool. Okay. Well, we got five or so minutes left. Alex, do you want to give us the next steps then for the next week?
If so, we don't have the topic for next week picked yet, so look out for that. But if anyone in the call has any suggestions for topics, I've got a massive backlog, but I'd love for it to be relatable to things you guys are doing and things you're interested in. But other than that, we can close it out.
And Eric, if you want access to the narrative platform, ping me on Slack and let's get you onboarded.
Yes, we'll do. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Alex, for hosting.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for presenting.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Take care.